Hi, and welcome to the last part of the computational action process, planning and making a long-lasting impact. I'm Nicole Payne. I'm a computer scientist at MIT, and I'm the creator of the computational action process. Computational action is licensed under the Creative Commons license and can be used or shared for non-commercial use. So today we'll wrap up the process with part 5. Let's get into it. I will go over today what it means to finish a project and how to think about what's next. So it's one thing to come up with a first solution, but another thing to consider making long-lasting impact and how to make a long-lasting contribution. This involves getting feedback from communities or users who are using your solution or your project, and continuing to go over the previous parts of computational action. Remember, at the very beginning, I talked about how this is a circle, and you can see it's a cyclical process. So it's a circle for a reason. It's important to go back to getting user feedback and redesigning and reiterating in order to make that long-lasting process. We'll get into what that means today. But first, I want to say congrats. You finished or you're nearly finished with your project. Whether you coded an app using App Inventor or made a web application or created a project involving artificial intelligence, or maybe you were inspired to create a non-technical project, you should feel really proud of yourself. First, I'll go over how you can put your project into communities and get user feedback, and then we'll talk about understanding that feedback of your project, and then we'll talk about planning for next steps or for long-term success. Okay, first, getting your solution to communities and users. We already talked about before getting user feedback using questions and surveys during that user research portion. You should absolutely feel free to use this again to get people's responses to your final project. This is because we want to make sure we're addressing the real problem that you defined at the very beginning and try to measure the impact of our contribution and then see if anything needs to be changed in order to contribute to making that impact for that problem that you defined. Okay, so number 1, how does your project help the community? What kind of impact and legacy do you hope to have? While you write the questions or the surveys or try to get the user feedback for your final project, try to keep in mind what was the impact that you wrote in your impact matrix. What kind of positive impact were you hoping to achieve? What kind of negative impact were you hoping to mitigate or minimize? And try to phrase questions that ask your users and communities whether your project is truly addressing those issues that you first defined or you learned about during your user research in section 2. So there is a tool in the toolkit, again, for this final section that can help you review your impact matrix and help you fill out how your final project is addressing or maybe is not addressing those impacts. And you can feel free to refer to that tool in the Computational Action Toolkit to help you with these questions. Let's take a look at how one high school student tried to get their project out into the hands of users. I really like this example because it's a little bit different than the other examples we've looked at in the past. This high school student created a medical research tool, and they discovered how they can get their medical research tool into the hands of users. And I really like it because it's done through quite a clever way, and they can try to use this way in order to measure the impact that they wanted to have with their project. So Cepha AI is what this project is called. And this high school student developed Cepha AI to help researchers find people who are interested to contribute to Parkinson's disease research. So by helping researchers find eligible participants, this project is helping us get closer to understanding this neurodegenerative disease, Parkinson's. So this app you can find online. The student made their app available online. And the app is very easy to use. It's very intuitive. It's quite simple. And it's great for both the potential participants, the users, as well as the researchers who are also users of this app. So this way that this student got their project out into the world and into the hands of real users was by putting this project online in order to get participants for research studies. When you put your project out into the world, you can consider how you want to measure your impact. And one way of doing this, one framework to think about it is in this framework that's a funnel. This funnel is to track users in each step of the user journey and try to see how they're interacting with your solution or the project that you put out into the world. So I've created a common funnel here, and I've changed it from what we might use in industry in order to be a bit based more on the impact that you want to have. So for instance, at the very beginning, a user might learn about your project or tool. And then they might start to try it. If you have a sign up, they might sign up for it. If you don't have a sign up, they might just become a visitor or start to engage with your project. And then they will interact with the tool, right? They will use the features that you put into your app or your tool, whether it's clicking on certain buttons or using the app for a certain amount of time. And then they might continue to use the app. So this is what we call maybe coming back into the app to use it again after another day, or continuing to engage the app after just one engagement or interaction. And then finally, an interesting part of the funnel that you can consider is also how people share your app or project. Do they tell other people to use it? Do they say you should try this out and you should also come and use this app? This is a final part of referral that is also an interesting way to gather data for you to see how your users or communities are engaging with your project. So as another tool that you can implement, if you do want to go a bit more into this technical implementation, I just want to offer you these tools that are, again, free to use, and they can track actual activity in apps or on a website. You certainly don't have to implement this for tracking, and when you're tracking, be sure to look into privacy or data rules that you might have to show or tell your users to inform them that you might be tracking their activity. But if you do have an app or if you did build a website, these could be useful tools to you to get information on how people are engaging with your tool or your app, or visiting or clicking on different things or not clicking on things. This could be very helpful data for you. So I recommend you look into it, but certainly this is very optional. This will just help you gather data if you're interested in gathering some more logging or some more technical data. So we talked about tracking, we talked about understanding user engagement, we talked about a funnel that you could use, and some technical tools that you can also use. Now we'll talk a bit more about communicating about your project and why you should care about communicating your project. So you've done pretty much all of that hard work, right? You've figured out what you want to work on, you've done user research, you've done design using the impact matrix and design using sketching and wireframing, and then you've implemented your project through coding or other forms of implementation. So communicating clearly about your project is sort of the last step to really help everyone understand what you've made and why it matters. A great way of communicating is actually to go back and summarize your computational action process. And all of those tools that you used in the computational action toolkit can be great tools for communicating your project to other people. So you can feel free to take advantage of all that work you already put in into your communication. Some tips on talking about what you created. Number one, you can assume that whoever you're speaking with might not know much about the problem you're addressing, so try to communicate clearly. Try again not to assume that they know the problem space already or assuming expertise in the area, but try instead to paint the entire picture. And as I mentioned, you can definitely rely on all of those things that you created in the Computational Action Toolkit in order to communicate clearly about your project. You can consider describing what was the problem that you set out to address and you discovered. Why should we care about this problem? Who are the users and communities affected? What were their needs that you found through user research? How does your project address those needs? How did you create your impact matrix to address those needs that you discovered in user research? And also, how will you plan for future improvements? Is there anything left to be done that you didn't get to? And I'll show you another tool to answer this final question later too. As another student example of how a student team communicated about their project and the impact they have on their communities, this project called Dough Keeper was an app created for the Technovation Girls Challenge by another team of high school students, and they were trying to help students better manage their finances. So let's take a look at their presentation of how they communicated what they created. So you can see they show first a look at their app and also a brief summary of what their app's intent is. They go into the inspiration and the motivation for this problem, how they figured out that problem, how they decided this is something they want to work on, which is a great part of communicating about your project. Then they go into all of the user research and market research and community analysis that they conducted, as well as the value added or what they designed to create solutions for the problems that they identified. So this is a very well done presentation, and you can take inspiration from this presentation. Certainly your communication about your project doesn't necessarily have to look like this, but this could be one idea for hopefully inspiring you for how you want to communicate about your project. So they discuss who their target users are, right? Who would benefit from this app? Their primary target are administrators, teachers. Their secondary target are parents of Generation Z who want to better manage their finances. They also talk about future plans. So they want to expand their target audience for their project, and they talk about future plans of social media marketing or content marketing. This also goes into quite a lot of detail about how they plan to market their app. And you certainly can feel free to add detail like this, or it's completely optional for your project. This is, again, inspiration for how you might think about communicating your project in your future plan. Speaking of future plan, thinking about next steps. So how should you go about thinking about how you can make that lasting impact in your community? First is to review your impact matrix. So this is, again, the last tool in that computational action toolkit. So feel free to follow along with that link from the website. But you want to go back to your impact matrix because perhaps after you finish your implementation of your project, now your project might look a little different, right? So you want to compare your impact matrix to this new matrix of your project's future plans. So here, what I added in here is some sections to get you to think about what you set out to make, right? What impact you try to have and what impact you wrote in the impact matrix. What your project was actually accomplishing, so what you actually got to do, what you actually implemented. And then maybe in the last section, some parts where you didn't get to that you hope to get to in the future, and really write that down in this matrix to help you crystallize the ideas between comparing what you set out to do in your impact matrix and what your final project is after implementation. From here, considering your project's future plans, you can create something like this example future project timeline. So here you can see there's items of bullets here for listing what you created, right? The mission statements that you accomplished, the impact that you accomplished, and then maybe next steps and short-term next steps. Like ideally, if you had some more time, what would you have liked to continue working on? Maybe some longer-term goals. And to create these longer-term goals that you see closer to the right hand of this slide, you try to get some of that user feedback on your existing project to then think about, okay, if I want to create a project that better meets user needs, what are some of these items? And you can go back and redo the computational action process in order to list out these longer-term future goals. Remember, a project is never the end-all be-all for addressing the problem that you first set out to address. There's always potential improvements, but it's really awesome and it's really great that you created this current project, this maybe first version to set out that you set out to address the problem that you first identified in section 1. Okay, so as a summary for considering how to make this timeline for future goals and plans, even if these are quite far off goals and plans, you can add in, like I mentioned, what you plan to include in your project, but maybe what you couldn't get to, had to leave out. What users are saying about your final project, using this solution. Potentially, you could have many different ideas branching out from this user feedback, but then you can use the computational action process in order to refine those ideas and then design future versions of your project or your solution. Other features or ideas that could be helpful for people in your community and could potentially be a part of your project in the future, you can feel free to add in some of these brainstorming ideas as you fill out that future timeline for future goals or future versions of your project. And finally, I encourage you to think about maybe some far off ideas, how you want to think about your contribution to this problem or how you want to make a lasting impact in not just this project, but maybe 1 year out or many years out or many years out into the future, it's totally okay to include some of these far off ideas as inspiration for future versions, but also not just for yourself, but perhaps for those who are you're presenting to or thinking about the project. You could inspire your audience too with these far off ideas, what some people call moonshots. In summary, what we talked about in this section was determining what your goal is for the impact of your project, right? So you want to revisit that impact matrix to help you solidify the goals that you previously set out and compare where you might have met those goals and maybe where you wanted more time to work towards those goals. You want to consider future versions you want to build and what that mission or vision is for your future versions of the project. And you can set up tools to measure user engagement, including user research surveys again, or the tools that I mentioned earlier that you can implement to get some more detailed tracking information. And of course, we talked about communicating about what your project is and why and how what you make makes a difference. Okay, so in review, you've learned the entire computational action process. We did all of these steps. You defined a problem. You did some user research to understand users and communities impacted. You used all that information. You put it into an impact matrix to design your solutions. And then you designed the front end of those solutions to show what it'll look like. You tested those front end screens with users to get a better sense of what your project should look like. And then you worked on the team or you implemented, you might have organized your project using tools like Trello or documented using tools like Google Docs to really wrap up that implementation of your project. And finally, in this section, we talked about how to compare the impact that you have that your project now has with what you set off to have, which you wrote in the impact matrix, and how to think about planning and making that long-lasting impact. So not just with one version of your project, but really extending your thoughts to the horizon about what could be possible in the future. Again, this process is cyclical, right? So feel free to always return back to the computational action process. It doesn't have to be necessarily for a new project. It could be if you get lost in one part of the project and you feel like you need inspiration, perhaps another part of the computational action process could be that inspiration for you. I hope that by learning the computational action process, you now feel empowered to define problems that you can solve. You feel like you can work towards solving those problems using technology that might include coding in App Inventor or coding in other interfaces, or maybe even a non-technical project solution. And finally, that you feel like you really are doing practices authentic to an engineer, an innovator, a scientist, because through the computational action process and by using the computational action toolkit, you certainly have been already doing practices that are authentic to the world of engineering. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the computational action process, and you can feel free to revisit any parts at any time.